get involved in this damn thing. They'll end up losing.
You hear what, Ken left us.
Yeah, that's what we're talking
That's
about.
what they're talking about this morning.
Governor Perdue wants to just pick anybody he
And they
wants.
started that new House bill that says they don't have to have a degree.
Yeah, I know.
Right.
That's what we were talking about.
Hmm.
Y'all will get a politician, ex-politician, then that'll look after himself.
Get a buddy for 3 years.
Yeah. Y'all won't get shit anymore.
Go back to where we came from, I guess.
Yep.
It's caught this way some.
Oh, it's got you.
Is he level?
We could all sit like this.
No, you're fine.
It might be
Come
just
here,
the way
look
it's
at it.
coming
All right.
out. It sure looks like it's tilted a little this way.
You're right.
Of course we are.
How's that?
That's much better there.
All right.
They took him to Homerville and took,
Who was it? You know who it was he?
I think Crick called him Dustin Stroker, Little D.
What they were talking about here.
I don't know.
Did he have a heart attack and
I think
fall out?
I don't know. They said he fell out of the set-out truck.
Yeah.
So this thing's recording, correct?
You are recording. Reason you can, how you can tell, is over there. You see the
says
little
record.
REC?
Okay, got it.
You are recording. Okay, I'm Bill Consoletti, and I'm the Georgia Division of Society of American Foresters historian. And we are here just outside of Fargo, Georgia, on Bill Oettmeier's deer house. And I've got Dave Mitchell sitting here, and he's a longtime Oak chapter member. And Bill Oettmeier, who is a Flatwoods, is that what you call it now? Flatwoods chapter. And for a long time, he was the manager of the Sewanee Forest for Superior Pine Products. And this is the first in a series, hopefully, of video history of important men in Georgia forestry history. Eric Harris is behind the camera. We can blame him. And he's a Georgia Forestry Commission forester. So, to start out with, I'd like to have Bill talk about the history of this area, the Sewanee Forest, before it became the Sewanee Forest. Like, whatever you know about what this was before.
Well, like a lot of the areas, the big lumber companies came in here and set up the sawmill and clear cut the area. And George, one of the things that they never get credit with, whenever we hear about the sawmills, we always heard about cut out and got out, which they did. But they left us a legacy. When they came in here for transportation, they built railroad lines in. And all the major railroad lines in this part of Georgia now were originally sawmill lines, including the one to Fargo that originally built the railroad into Fargo. It stopped at the river, and it was as far as you could go. And they built eventually on into Moniac and then on into Jacksonville. That was the way it originally started. They left, and the only thing they could do with this land then, it was all in cattle. And the cattle companies came in, and they had a policy of burning every spring for graze. And of course that pretty much wiped out the slash pine. The only pine left on what we call a hill down here, which means land that doesn't have water in it, was longleaf. So we had pretty much a longleaf stand, and that was it. And the only slash around were in the ponds. And then the turpentine, people began to come into the area. Our company, original company, parent company of Superior Pine, was a company called Papermakers Chemical. And Papermakers was the largest supplier of chemicals to the paper trade. And one of the products that they needed was rosin. And they never could get a sufficient amount of rosin, of good quality rosin, so they decided finally, well, we'll produce our own. And we'll go to South Georgia and we'll buy 200,000 acres of land and put in our own stills. And that's exactly what they did.
Can we put some dates on when, so far as you know, the loggers first came in and cleared the land?
The loggers first started coming in the late early 1900s. I think there was some mills in here as early as 1902 and 3, and they stayed in. They eventually all left by about 1920. And that's when it became cattle country. It was in the 20s. And as I said, the turpentine industry began to move in around mid-20s. And one of the things, of course, that they had to do was stop the burners. The people here were used to summer graze. They were used to going out and grazing for burning graze every spring, and it just got to be a habit to burn. And when the companies came in and wanted to grow pine trees, they wanted to stop that. I remember my dad wanted to get slash pine growing on again what we called the hill. And one of the old timers said, "Oh, Mr. Bill, slash pine won't grow in the hill. It has to have its foot in water." And of course that wasn't so. What it was, they were not very fire tolerant. And it was a real problem stopping the burning so they could get into the timber business.
I remember reading that in that book on Langdale. So you mentioned 1926?
1926 is when Superior Pine came in. Purchased 218,000 acres of land. Well, the Florida line was our border for a portion of it. The Swanee River is the border on one side, and the Okeechobee Swamp. We got in the turpentine business, and at one time there were 5 stills running on Swanee Forest. And that's when Superior Pine began a long-term friendship with the Langdale Company. Langdale Company operated most of the stills on Swanee Forest.
How many, 1,000 faces is called?
10,000 faces
10,000
are
crops.
crop.
How many crops?
Oh, I remember at one time there were 32 crops. And that was in my time. And before that, I'm sure there were more than that. You can put a lot of turpentine faces on 200,000 acres of land. And the interesting thing about that, the quality of rosin that was produced on Swanee Forest was of too high quality to use in the paper business. And Superior Pine was never able to use any of the rosin that they produced here. And eventually, the paper-making chemical was dissolved and sold the chemical business to Hercules. And the stockholders decided to retain the land in South Georgia with hopes it might be worth something one day. Did a pretty good job on that.
What paper mills?
Well, originally, when this was started, there was no paper business in this part of the country. That was before Dr. Hurdy found out you could make paper out of pine trees. But when that began to come in, and the mills started moving south, they wouldn't move south unless they had a secure source of wood. And all the mills back then felt like they had to have a certain amount of the supply that they controlled themselves. And they began to buy up a lot of the land in South Georgia. And we were approached, Superior Pine was approached. We're not interested in selling. So the concept came up of a long-term timber cutting agreement, not a lease of land, but a timber cutting agreement. And there was a reason behind the timber cutting agreement. It was try to use it as a wording that would allow the landowner to get capital gains on a sale of timber, which it did not work out. The courts ruled that it was ordinary income for the rental land. But anyway, they were beginning to start with that, and our first dealings were with Rayonier. And we never could come to terms with Rayonier. In fact, it got down to the signing of the contract, and at the last minute there was some disagreement. So that fell apart, and in 1949 we signed a 60-year contract with St. Regis Paper Company that went on for 57 years. Then we agreed through the years. St. Regis first was acquired by Champion. Champion came in as a white knight and took over St. Regis when they buy the Jimmy Goldsmiths.
Yeah.
And people like that were buying the companies and selling assets off. But St. Regis went to Champion International, and they acquired them. And then eventually Champion International was bought out by International Paper Company. And our contract was with International. And then with 3 years left on the contract, we came to an agreement with International to end it. And Superior Pine's back on its own now.
With 3 years left, that would have been just last year.
Yes.
2006. That's quite an accomplishment. 57.
So January 1, 2006, we were on, which was nice.
just for history here, what are the other mills that are, say, within, if you were going to sell to, what's your radius
Well,
of procurement? Where could you have
you know,
sold to?
it was interesting when the change came about 10 years ago and the companies began to go out of business. A lot of the mills, there was a time when there was probably 8 or 10 mills that drew wood out of this area. And now those mills have been acquired and closed. We're down now to almost, just about our only source is Container Corporation and some wood to Rayonier for pulpwood. And then, of course, saw timber goes to International Paper Company, the Langdale Company, and some to Gilman.
Yeah, I know the Gilman Mill became Durango, and then
Then closed.
gone.
Then closed, and now it's going to be shopping centers and housing. But you got to stop and make sure your sounds work.
Okay.
Just to make sure. I'd hate to do all this, then have to do it over.
Can you?
I just hit it.
I don't have a cat.
But when gonna retire?
Gone.
I thought he was gone. Who took his place?
And then they have fried green tomatoes.
Okay, we're back, and Bill wanted to mention the harvesting practices here, and I'll just remind them about radios and fire plows.
Yeah. Several things, there were several innovations made here on Swanee Forest. When my dad came down, he was a graduate of Penn State, and before going to Penn State, he'd spent 5 years in the Marine Corps, in the Signal Corps Division of the Marine Corps operating radios. And communications in this whole area was a real problem. The communications back then were from the fire tower to fire tower. There was a telephone line. It was a single wire telephone line. It used a common ground, and reception at best was bad. And if someone was out and they spotted a fire, they'd pull out a pair of climbing hooks and climb the pole or tree that the wire went to, and had a little phone they carried with them they could hook on, and hopefully they could get in touch with someone. And hopefully even the towers could communicate when there was a fire. And my dad decided that radio was the thing to do, and he went to the FCC to get a license. And they fought him on it. They said only government entities should have licenses, and no private company should have a license to operate radio. And that led to quite a fight. And finally, he got the first license and put in the radio station, K4NEE, were the first call letters. And back then, he had to build everything. You built your own equipment, own radios. Dad built the radios. And I remember somewhere around there's a picture of one of the pickup trucks. He wanted a quarter wavelength of wire for the antenna. And of course nowadays that's able to reduce down into a little whip antenna. Back then you had to have the full quarter of a wavelength. And so he built what he called chicken coops. It was a box on top of the pickups that had the wire just wrapped round and round it. And it was crude, but it was effective. And that changed fire control. It changed being able to dispatch your people to fires, and for safety reasons even. You had, all of a sudden you had contact with the people in the woods. And then fighting the fires was a problem. Back then they fought fires with the first thing you did when you got to the fire was everybody cut down a pine tree and used a pine top to try to beat the fires out. And the plows that were used back then were very crude. I've seen the pictures of one of the old plows, original plows, and it had a barrel on the back of it. And I asked my dad what the barrel was for, and he said that had parts in it, so he could fix the plow. So he called a machine shop down in Lake City, called a fellow named Mr. Mathis, came up, and Dad explained to him what he needed in a plow. And Mr. Mathis went back and built the first Mathis plow, and it was brought down, and it was used on Swanee Forest for probably 35 or 40 years. And then in 1975, that plow was given to the Smithsonian Institute, and it's in Washington at the Smithsonian now. And those were two of the innovations. One of the things that's been interesting to watch through the years are the changes in the harvest of timber and how it's changed. I know when I was a young forester, the minimum diameter any of the mills would take was 4.5 inches, because they said they couldn't make anything out of anything that was less than 4.5 inches in diameter. So you'd go out to the pulpwood crews, and you'd get an oil can, which was no problem whenever everybody changed their oil. They just threw the oil cans down on the ground. And you get an oil can, you cut both ends out of it, and you give it to the person loading the truck and tell them, if this will fit over the end of the wood, it's too small, you have to leave it in the woods. And the saws, originally, of course, were cross-cut. And then they went to the old wheel saw, which was a big saw. It looked a little bit like the Yazoo lawnmowers look now, with big wheels and had a round blade in the front. And you could always tell a man that ran that saw, because he never had these fingers raw. The way he cranked it was you pulled on the belt to go into the saw, and that would turn the engine over and crank it. And of course, every now and then it would crank and do that. It'd take these fingers off, and an awful lot of legs were lost. I can remember when I was a boy, them coming in, and you'd stick that saw into a tree and they'd kick out, and they did. It'd come around and they'd just take legs off. And then, of course, the chainsaw came along, and the chainsaw was used for years to fell the timber. And then the chip mill was invented, and they began to produce the log. Rather than pulpwood to go to the mills, they'd take whole-length logs into the chip mills, and one of the first chip mills was built here in Fargo. And the logs originally were cut with chainsaws and loaded on the trucks with the old logger's dream, equipment like that. And a lot of innovations were made here at Fargo. They began to use a machine called, they called it a snipper at first, the cut-down machine, and it looked like a pair of scissors on the front of a D6 Caterpillar, and it went around the shear and went around and cut the trees, and that was quite an improvement. But it only threw the trees in one direction, so it was a problem. You had to be very careful where you cut them, because you couldn't pull them out if you cut them in the wrong direction. And then, of course, eventually the wheel shear came along, and with the bunchers on it, where you could punch it and lay it down and put it the way you wanted. But one of the things that changed so much was from using that oil can as the smallest that you could take. They began to find out they could produce more and more out of what was left, and the larger trees began to go to saw timber. And then, of course, the chipping saw came along, and the diameters got even smaller. And it's so interesting now to watch a load of logs leave here. Anything that the oil can won't fit over now goes for saw timber. And the saw timber is the stuff that we used to leave in the woods as debris. And that's been one of the biggest innovations and changed the yield from the forest so much. Because now everything that we used as pulpwood is saw timber, and the things that we left as trash is pulpwood.
What's the rotation? How many rotations are we at?
Well, we're on the fourth rotation here. Our rotations are 25 years. Of course, we had the original stand was pretty spotty. It was what was left were the understory trees, and the trees were pretty rough looking to start with. And then they began to protect the forest, and the slash began to come in. And one of the first nurseries, we built a nursery here at Fargo, and began to plant some pine trees. In fact, this stand out here was planted in 1947. That's a planted stand behind us. And began to do a good bit of planting. And of course, then we went into the pulpwood rotation. And well, originally you planted flat woods, and there's flat woods down here. You were looking at 35, 40-year rotation. And we had the fire in 1955 that really changed management. In 1955, we had drought conditions, and lightning started a fire up about 15 miles from where we're sitting right now. It started on a Friday, and it was in a pond on International Paper Company, and they plowed around the pond. And on Monday morning, the fire jumped. And I was a youngster working at the shop as a grease monkey. And at 4 o'clock that afternoon, they came and got us, said, "We've got to go to the fire. We have a fire." And I came back in 3 days later. And I've heard a lot of people say they fought the fire in 55, and when they do, I always accuse them of lying. I ran like hell for 3 days, and I had a lot of people running with me. There was no such thing as fighting that fire. We had every plow in this part of the country on it, and the fire jumped the Southern Railroad. And then when it came to the US 441 right away, we had the road lined with people waiting. and a sheet of fire came up and it just laid across it and kept going. It burned through this area here. This area was burned. And it burned into the Swanee, across the Swanee, into the Okeechobee, and it burned the Okeechobee. And we lost on Superior Pine 90,000 acres in 3 days. And I mean, it was a complete loss. It burned it up. We had sawmills in from everywhere. Peckerwood sawmills trying to salvage the timber, and salvaged an awful lot of the timber that was burned. But then we woke up one morning with 90,000 acres of bare land. And there were no nurseries, not enough nurseries to plant. And of course, with the amount of money that pine pulpwood brought in, you couldn't afford to plant. So we did aerial seeding, and it was very scientific the way we did it. We had a Piper Cub with a man hanging out the window dumping the seeds out of a sack. And with that, you know, you got a really consistent stand. You either had too many or too few. And we had acres that had 15 trees an acre, and we had acres that had 5,000 stems to the acre. And it took us a rotation to get rid of that. Finally, well, the thing that saved us, we had all these acres that had too many stems on it. We didn't know what we were going to do with it, and the whole tree chipper came out. And they were the mode for a while, and we were lucky that we were able to use that to get rid of a lot of those thin stands. Of course, then they were planted back. And through the years, we've seen the rotation shorten and change, and now everything we plant is fifth row thinned, and then grown on to a 35-year rotation. Actually, we've lengthened the rotation now from a 25-year pulpwood only rotation to a 35 solid wood product rotation. And we use herbicides now.
What species do you plant?
Plant slash. We have some loblolly, and loblolly is, of course, grows a lot faster than slash, but it's out of its habitat here, and you have to treat them different. You have to apply DAP and nitrogen to them. If you do, it'll grow like a weed. But if you don't, it gets up it'll grow fine for about the first 8 or 10 years, and it turns yellow and just stops growing. And there's a loblolly stand just about 200 yards from us over there. It was thin now. DAP was applied to it and nitrogen. And there's no comparison to it and a slash stand beside it. But we still have fires here. And it's a problem, of course, for loblolly and slash when we do. We have very little longleaf planted on the forest. I planted some on my personal land here that's not too far over there, and it's been very unsuccessful. It's 25 years old now, and I've had a really hard time with it. It was planted bare root, and we did plant a few acres of the containerized longleaf, and they did well, but we're probably 95% slash here on Swanee Forest now.
I have written down here in my notes to ask you, we haven't talked about this that much. Politics, land, turpentine, and timber. Politics in South Georgia. The local politicians pretty supportive of everything you did? Did they fight different things you did?
No, you know, the landowners in South Georgia have always been very active in support of the communities. The local landowners have. The paper companies that originally came in were very supportive too. We've all stayed out of politics. I don't know of anyone that's gotten into with any of the original companies down there, which were mostly family companies. Superior Pine, when they came in, there were several companies started buying land in this area, several families, and the land was acquired in large blocks. Superior Pine had 200,000 acres. The Langdale brothers came in and started acquiring land, and they have about the same amount. I'm not sure exactly what Langdale's acreage is in this area. They've been acquiring. The Carter family, Ivy Carter, came in and acquired a good bit of land in this area. And it took a lot of land back then. It took a lot of land if you were in the cattle business. It took an awful lot of land if you were in the turpentine business, which most of those people I mentioned were. And so there were no small ownerships, and there still are no small ownerships in this area.
And just for the record, who's the family that owned Swanee Forest?
Well, there were three families originally that owned Papermaker Chemical. The Lawrence family, the Williams family, and the Knight family, and those were the three original owners. And
In partnership?
it was a partnership. It was a corporation. They formed a corporation, and through the years, the Lawrence family and the Williams family have maintained their ownership. The Knight family stock has been some dissolution there, and there are a few outside owners in the company now, but principally it's still owned by the three families.
Okay. Dave, I've been asking a lot of questions, Dave Mitchell. Do you have anything that you've heard me say that, would you like to add or ask Bill that I haven't?
No, I think Bill's been pretty complete.
Okay. Since this is for SAF, what's been your history with SAF and anything that you want to say about SAF in this area?
Well, I've always been a member of the SAF, and I've always been active in it. I was Georgia chair, and I believe in the SAF. I believe in what they do. But there are other organizations, of course, that we've all been active in. One organization that I'd have to mention, and I was remiss in not mentioning it, was started here, was an organization called Gold that was started around the swamp. There are a number of landowners that own property around the Oettmeier. And the Oettmeier was always a problem for us. It was a hazard. Fire started in there. There was nothing you could do but wait for them to come out. And whichever way the direction went, the owners on that side suffered. And it was a real problem. And we always had an adversarial relationship with the management of Oettmeier. And about 10 years ago, Skippy Reeves became the manager of the Oettmeier Swamp for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And Skippy came to see a couple of the landowners around the swamp, including myself, and said, I'd like to establish some sort of relationship with y'all and change our relationship. And of course, that was good news to us because we really had a bad relationship with the people in the swamp. And we sat down, and one thing led to another, and finally we formed an organization called GOLD, the Greater Oettmeier Association of Landowners. And all the landowners, private landowners, and the companies around the swamp became members of GOLD. We share all of our equipment, we share our manpower, and all of our resources when there's a fire in or around the swamp. We each have each other's radio frequencies, and everyone has a list of what equipment the other have. We like Superior Pine, we have 2 D6 Caterpillar tractors that are available for our neighbors, and a lot of times we may not go to the fire, but we may take over protection in this area and allow the Georgia Forestry Commission to go to the fire with their tractors and take more tractors to it than they normally would. Also, Skippy Reeves started a policy with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and with us in the swamp that fire in the Oettmeier is good. It's a fire. It has a fire regeneration. It needs that to reduce the peat moss in there. Fire is good until it turns towards the private landowner. And when it does that, Skippy would put every resource that he had towards stopping that fire before it hit private land, and when it hit private land, everything he owned would be there. He brought in tankers, tanker trucks. We've had big fires since then, and we had absolute and complete cooperation from U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So, and Gold has become a model of the relationship. We've had people come in from all over the United States to look at Gold and how it works, and it does work. I think it's changed our attitude towards the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and now the U.S. Forest Service has joined us. They own a good bit of land on the bottom end of the Oettmeier, and they have become a member of Gold, and our relationship with the U.S. Forest Service, again, has improved.
How about the Sheriff's Boys Ranch? What you done with that?
The Sheriff's Boys Ranch is my love. A number of years ago, we had an overpopulation of deer in here, and I needed to reduce it. And I tried to think of something I could do, and I was aware of the Georgia Sheriff's Boys Ranch over in Hayhire, about 60 miles from here. And it's a ranch not for bad children, There's children from bad homes and some children from no homes. And so I invited them to bring some boys over to hunt. And we had a difficult time getting the agreement made to bring them over. And I had to hunt for them. And the thing that I wanted to do, you know, kids nowadays, they see on television, they see athletes, famous athletes, and famous movie stars and famous businessmen, and they're all jerks. And they're always doing something that I don't approve of, and I wanted those boys to meet people that were famous, that were nice, and they weren't like that. And the first help I got was from the Atlanta Braves. Glenn Hubbard, the coach, came down, and then he introduced me to Bruce Suter. And Bruce has been coming for 8 years now, every year as faithful as he can be. Of course, Bruce was inducted in the Baseball Hall of Fame this year. The Jaguar football team. I'll have 4 or 5 of the really nice players from that team that come down and let the folks see they're nice. Mark Brunell, when he was with the Jacksonville Jaguars, came. Jeff Logan, the defensive captain. And these are nice people. And then Chuck Lavelle. To let the kids find out that you can be a rock and roll star and be nice. And that's been important to me. So this year we had the 21st hunt, and the mascots from the Jacksonville Jaguars and the Jacksonville Sun come down. Jackson DeVille, and I forget what the name of the Sun's mascot is. They put on a safety show for those kids. And it's been interesting. Of course, I've been on the board of the Georgia Sheriff's Youth Homes for 20 some odd years too, and on the state board. And I very much approve of what they do. Each ranch has its own board of directors, and those directors raise money for the ranch. They control that money completely. And none of it's used for salary, it's used for the boys and things on the ranch. The ranch itself is operated by funds that the Georgia Sheriff Association raises. But with the money it's raised locally, it's spent locally, like we have repaired and replaced the swimming pool at the boys' ranch. No small amount of money. And I like to participate in something that 100% of the funds are used for the purpose. And it's, like I said, it's been a love of mine. And it's been interesting to watch some of those kids grow up and change from children with no future and very little education. One of the youngsters that came and hunted here is in his second year of medical school. One graduated from the Citadel, and he was really had nothing when he came to the ranch. He graduated from the Citadel about 4 years ago and went to Miami and went in the real estate business. And year before last, he came back to the Christmas party and he presented the ranch with a check for $5,000 to cover some of the money they spent on him. And this past year, he came back and presented him a check for $25,000. Those kind of things really make you smile. I keep a picture of all the kids that have hunted here. His picture's on the wall inside.
Well, these
All the
kids
kids with a
actually,
little blood on their face?
Yeah, they kill their first year, they get bloodied. And you know, I let the football players hunt when they come up. And if they kill their first year, they get bloodied just a lot. Kids get a great kick out of
well,
it.
the kids get to hunt with the
With one of the stars.
stars,
Yeah.
celebrity.
Yeah, like the youngster this year hunted with Bruce Suter. And I can't say enough nice things about the athletes that come up here. They're all good people. Bruce Suter's one of the nicest people I've ever met in my life. Most of them are very strong Christians. I've never met a stronger Christian than Mark Brunell, quarterback. Now he's a quarterback at the Redskins now. And just really genuine, nice people. And I think we all need to know that the majority of the athletes are nice people. They're not like the ones you see with all the gold and the rings and in trouble all the time.
Yep.
And that was important to me, that these kids find out that you can be successful and give back. And I think it's on a small scale, just a few kids every year, but you'd be surprised the good that's come from that.
You said that you grew up in the wood business and around here. So for the record, can you remember some old-timers' names that in South Georgia Forest history? Of course, I know Howie Langdale and his dad, Judge.
I grew up with the Langdales. I knew all of the Langdales, of course, and all the old icons. back in those days, the woodlands managers for the paper companies were really someone to meet. I tell you what, they were all interesting. Ernie Allen with Union Camp in Savannah, and Mark Rawls, and with St. Regis in Jacksonville. Those people were icons in this business. What they brought south, and the chances they took to improve the business in this country. Mark Rawls particularly did an awful lot that brought the innovations to forestry, and most of them that were done here were the responsibility of people like Mark Rawls. And they were all really, most of them were self-made men. And they were really sharp. They were all supporters of the SAN. And they were all good people. That's through the years there have been some interesting people in the timber business. But of course, I was raised in it because my dad was in it. My dad was on his way to Washington years ago, and Judge Langdale was on the train going to Washington. Also, he was going up to testify before Congress on a problem that affected the turpentine business, but it also affected the timber business. And he said, Bill, you should go testify. There's nobody to represent the forest industry. And my dad went and he testified, and he came back and he called a group of landowners, and he said, we need an association to represent us in Washington. And Forest Landowners was formed from that. And I think Dad was the president the first 10 or 12 years. And I served as president twice of it. It's a good organization that represents private landowners in Washington. And originally was forest farmers. For years it was forest farmers. I still call it that a lot, but once several years ago they changed it to Forest Landowners organization to be a little bit more representative.
Any stories about the Georgia Forestry Commission around here over the years?
Yeah, our relationship with the Forestry Commission here has always been so good. We depend on them. They're our lifeblood. And we have never had a bad relationship with the Georgia Forestry Commission. We've always been very supportive of it and the people involved, and they've done the same for us. These kids that drive these tractors, I can't say enough nice about it. You drive up to a fire, and there's a fire out there with a head fire on it coming 10 or 15 miles an hour, taking the tops out of trees as big as these. And those kids jump on those tractors and they go out there and put themselves in those fire plows in front of that and stop it. And I can't say enough nice things about those people, how good they are at their business and how brave they are. They're a different breed. It takes a different breed to jump on that. And young men like Eric Harris, our ranger here, he's well respected. It doesn't matter how big the fire is. Through Gold, when we have a fire here, command center is set up, and there will be a representative from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife in charge of their part of the fire, and then a representative from the Georgia Forestry Commission is our representative on the fire. And Eric is always it, and we all have great confidence in him and the job he does. It's a great relationship.
The SPCA, the association,
Southern Pulpwood Conservation
Southern Pulpwood
Association.
Contractors Association.
It was Southern Pulpwood
Conservation
Association.
That was an old association of particularly of procurement people and procurement foresters from the different paper companies, and that was in the old days when everyone had a large expense account, and it was a different time. It was a different world back then from the way it is now. And some of those SPCA meetings I think that it's best that nothing ever be told about them, especially in the archives. But they were something that was where we all did our met the people from the other companies and shared experiences as much as we could. About the time that the SPCA was going so well was when they came out with the the laws that you couldn't discuss business with each other. And that broke up a lot of meetings like that because we get together and discuss our problems. And I'm sure at sometimes prices were discussed. And then it became, when it got where you could go to jail for that, that all ended.
I think I'd like to finish up with your thoughts on the changing forest ownership patterns in Georgia. I'm employed by Midwest Vaco, and we're just recently announced a 300,000 acre sale. IP sold their land, Georgia Pacific sold their land.
Well-
Weyerhaeuser still owns land, not too many do.
We've watched that, and you know, one of the things that a lot of the companies were forced to sell, and it's a problem for us. Ad valorem taxes have just gone out of sight, especially in the near the metropolitan areas. I heard a representative of your company say that they had some land that the tax had gotten up to $90 an acre, and you can't grow timber on that. It's really approaching the point here that it's difficult for us to make a profit with ad valorem taxes. And in a lot of the counties, we have a lot of acreage but very little vote power, and it's easy to assess it. And as real estate goes up, our land can be assessed as real estate even though we grow timber on it. Several years ago, we passed Amendment 3, as we call it, and it was where land had to be assessed as forest land if it was in the forest practices, and maximum rates were set across the state. And if you had forest land that you used as forest land and you signed a covenant that you'd keep it in it for 10 years, then it couldn't be taxed as real estate. But we made one mistake. We limited it to 2,000 acres, and it didn't protect the large ownerships. And so many of the acres now are being turned into subdivisions. And you know, I watched the companies, the land that's sold, the people who have bought it have broken it up and sold it again in smaller blocks. And I don't know what's going to happen to our business or our industry, because, you know, all of our equipment now is based on large volumes and large tracts. And tracts that were 200,000 acres now, they're probably 200,000 acre tracts now, or less, or maybe twice that in 500 acre tracts, and some even smaller. And an awful lot of it has just gone completely out of production. And my chimes are losing.
I know if the land goes to a TMO, their planning horizon is 5 or 10 years, and they're going to harvest as much as they can to meet the needs of the owners, to meet the needs of their...
Yeah, a lot of those have a life of 5 to 10 years, and then they're going to be sold at the end of that. It's hard to do 30-year planning when you have a 5 or 10-year horizon. And of course, all of those that acquire land are selling off their higher, better use land immediately. And unfortunately, a lot of that land is also the best, most productive land.
So in 50 years, do you think there'll be a Sewanee forest?
I hope so. It'll be different. I hope there's a market for the products off of Sewanee Forest in 50 years. I think where we're located, we'll eventually get the real estate pressure, and we're getting some now from what we call the halfbacks, the people that moved to Florida and discovered the hurricanes and the taxes down there. And they don't want to move back north, they want to move halfway back. And they want to settle in this area. We get pressure from that. We have such a large acreage, I don't think that the threat to Sewanee Forest is from that type of development. I think it's from the products. I think we're seeing more and more of our different businesses go overseas, and we've become more dependent on other people. And we see the paper industry doing that now. We don't have, like, 10 years ago, we've got half as many mills, and probably 20 years ago, a third of the mills we had. And that product goes. One of the things that may, and I didn't touch on this, it may help us some, is as fuel prices go up, there's more emphasis on making fuel out of different products, and one of them they're looking at is wood in this area. And it's strange enough what they're looking at, again, is what we consider waste wood. The tops and the limbs, the things that we pile up and burn now, there's a chance that may be made into fuel one day. I think for Swanee Forest to exist 50 years from now, it will be because we've learned to produce a different product. It won't be for the products we produce now.
Well, thank you, Bill Oettmeier. I appreciate your time. And Eric Harris behind the camera over there, we appreciate you. We look forward to seeing this on tape and
I'd like
having
to
you
see
preview it. Thanks.
I'd like a copy of it for my children.
Absolutely.
I'm trying to leave them as much as I can, while I can. I'm glad I got here. If we'd have done that several months ago, I had no hair.
That's all right. I chopped your head off a couple times.
That's all right. I enjoy talking about the history of the business. I got to work through an exciting time.
The good old days.
What is it? I can't even think of what
If I don't catch you, I'll come back in the smoke.
Well, it's supposed to warm up a lot
Supposed
by
to,
the weekend, isn't it?
Hopefully in the 70s.
Yeah.